This year, she is that option. Oh my goodness! To fast break points. And now Angel Reese. Couple of blocks already for Angel, and she bothers another one.
Wow.
Blocks for Angel. She already had 2.
Out of here.
That's 1.
Out of here.
They've already sets the screen.
Folks, we're like shooting from down here. Of course, we're gonna get our shot blocked. We're in the professionals, and we still haven't realized to finish up high. Wow, Becky couldn't believe her mind. Look at some of these calls.
Left in the regular season, including
Dude,
a break coming up.
come on.
The 3-point line. Reese thinking about it now. 1 bounce.
Yeah. Protected species. Sandy Bindello's right. Angel Reese, a protected species when it comes to these foul calls. You really can't make it up. She always has such a low release point. It's so easy to block her shots. She has 0 skill whatsoever. Damn. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Those shots weren't going in anyway. Damn. And she traveled 10 times plus 4 turnovers she didn't get credit for. Wow. But she's the best in the W. Damn.
6 blocks in a single professional basketball game. 6 times, Angel Reese went up to score, and 6 times she got sent back empty-handed. And this wasn't against some scrappy underdog team fighting for their playoff lives. This was a regular WNBA game, and she got rejected at the rim so many times that it started feeling less like basketball and more like a highlight reel for the defense. But the blocks weren't even the most controversial part of the night. Because while Reese was getting stuffed repeatedly at the rim, the referees were simultaneously handing her points on a silver platter at the free throw line. Becky Hammond watched the whole thing unfold, and by the time she'd seen enough, she was walking to the locker room with 2 technicals. One night, multiple disasters. And a whole lot of questions that nobody seems to want to answer honestly. Here's exactly what went down. Before we even get to what happened against the Las Vegas Aces, we need to talk about the mental state Angel Reese brought into that arena, because she didn't show up fresh and ready to prove something. She showed up haunted, her own words. She came out publicly and admitted that after her previous game, one of the most brutally criticized performances in recent WNBA memory, she couldn't sleep. Not a little restless, not tossing and turning for an hour. She said she lay awake replaying one specific moment over and over again, unable to shut it off, unable to move past it. And what was that moment? A wide-open layup, a game winner. The kind of shot that every player at every level, from high school gyms to professional arenas, practices thousands of times until it becomes muscle memory. Reese had the ball, had the moment, had the opportunity to be the hero, and she missed it. Clean miss. No contact, no defender draped all over her, no real excuse. Just a missed layup that ended the game and apparently ended her ability to sleep for the next several nights. Now here's the thing about that admission. On one hand, you can respect the honesty. Athletes who pretend nothing bothers them and put on a stone face after disasters are often criticized for being robotic and disconnected. So the fact that she came out and said this affected her, that she was replaying it, shows some vulnerability. But on the other hand, when you're a professional athlete at the highest level of your sport, the mental side of the game is just as critical as the physical. If a missed wide open layup is keeping you up at night, what happens when the moments get even bigger? What happens in the playoffs? What happens when the pressure compounds and the stakes are higher than a regular season game? The reason this matters is because it set the tone for everything that followed against the Aces. She didn't come in with confidence. She came in with something to prove, which sounds motivating on paper, but in practice often leads to forcing things, rushing decisions, and trying too hard in moments that require patience and calm. And that's exactly what we saw unfold across 39 minutes of basketball that had fans and analysts doing double takes at their screens. The previous game hadn't just been a bad shooting night. It had been a collection of fundamental mistakes that piled up in a way that was difficult to ignore. Wide open layups missed. Poor decision-making in crucial moments. A game-winner attempt that looked more like a desperation heave than a practiced, confident shot from a player who belongs on that stage. The internet didn't let it go quietly. Clips circulated, commentary poured in, and Reese's name became one of the most talked about in basketball for all the wrong reasons that week. So when she said she couldn't sleep, nobody who had been watching was particularly surprised. What was surprising was that she seemed genuinely caught off guard by her own reaction to it. She said it herself. Why would she let that moment dictate everything else she had going on? And that's actually the right question to ask. The problem is that asking the right question and actually answering it on the court are two very different challenges. Plenty of athletes have had the self-awareness to identify exactly what's going wrong mentally and still gone out the next game, and repeated the same patterns because awareness alone doesn't fix the underlying issue. And the underlying issue heading into the Aces game wasn't just confidence, it was fundamentals. It was the kind of stuff that coaches drill into players before they even get to high school ball, finishing high at the rim, reading the defense before making a move, understanding when to attack and when to pull back. These aren't advanced concepts. These are the building blocks of basketball, and there were serious questions heading into this game about whether Reese had those foundations as solid as they needed to be at the professional level. She came into the Aces game carrying all of that weight. The sleepless nights, the public scrutiny, the viral clips of missed layups, and the pressure of needing to show that last game was an anomaly rather than a pattern. What happened next answered that question in the most brutal way possible. Let's just sit with that number for a second. 6 blocks in one game at the professional level, where every player on that court has spent years, sometimes decades, refining the craft of finishing around shot blockers, learning how to protect the ball, how to use body angles, how to get the referee's attention when a defender makes contact. 6 blocks isn't just a bad game. 6 blocks in a single outing is the kind of statistical anomaly that makes analysts go back through the record books to find a comparison, and the comparisons are not flattering. What makes the 6 blocks particularly damaging isn't just the number itself. It's the way they happened. Because if you watch the film and the clips spread faster than a wildfire online, you notice something that goes beyond a defender simply outplaying her in a single moment. There's a pattern. A deeply consistent, deeply troubling pattern that appears in block after block after block. Her release point is low. Dangerously low for a player operating in the paint against professional athletes whose entire job description includes protecting the rim. In the post, at the professional level, you finish high. You go up strong, you extend through contact, you get the ball above the reach of the defender before you release it. This is foundational. This is something that gets corrected in practice long before a player ever steps into a professional game. And yet, clip after clip showed Reese releasing the ball at a point where defenders didn't even need to fully extend to get a piece of it. They weren't making extraordinary athletic plays. They were making routine defensive plays against a release point that simply wasn't where it needed to be. The first block stung. The second one raised eyebrows. By the third and fourth, the conversation had shifted from tough night to something much more uncomfortable. People watching weren't just reacting to a player having an off shooting night. They were watching what appeared to be a fundamental mechanical problem that no amount of effort or hustle can paper over. You can want to score badly. You can drive hard to the basket with full commitment. But if the ball leaves your hand at the wrong height, the result is going to be the same regardless of how much heart you put into the attempt. Block number 5 started pulling real reactions. Not just casual commentary, but genuine disbelief from people who watch basketball at a high level regularly. Because by that point, the pattern wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was a confirmed tendency. And any defender on that Aces roster who hadn't already identified it in film study was certainly identifying it in real time, which made block number 6 feel almost inevitable. And when it happened, the conversation stopped being about Angel Reese having a rough patch and started being about whether the fundamental skills required to be an elite professional post player were actually there. There were also traveling calls scattered throughout the game on top of the blocks. Multiple trips where she picked up her pivot foot or took an extra step that the officials caught. And here's why that matters in the context of the block shots. The travels suggest she's rushing. She's not setting herself properly before making her move. She's trying to get to the spot quickly enough to create an advantage, but in doing so she's skipping the steps that create the clean position you need to actually finish. The blocks and the travels aren't separate problems. They're symptoms of the same underlying issue, which is that the footwork and the mechanics in the paint need serious work. Now let's be fair here for a moment, because fairness matters when the pylon gets this intense. She did put up 21 points. She did grab 10 rebounds. She did play 39 minutes. Those are not nothing numbers. A player having a completely terrible game doesn't finish with a stat line like that. So something was working. The question that keeps coming up, and it's a legitimate one, is where exactly those 21 points came from. Because the field goal shooting, 6 for 13, tells a story of someone who was getting stopped at the rim repeatedly and struggling to convert when she actually got a clean look. So if she only made 6 field goals but finished with 21 points, the math forces you to look somewhere else. And that somewhere else is the free throw line, which opens up an entirely different and arguably even more controversial conversation about what we actually watched in this game and what it means for how we evaluate her numbers going forward. But before we get there, it's worth noting one more thing about the blocks. The defenders who stuffed her weren't all 7-foot shot blocking specialists. These were standard defensive players doing standard defensive things. And that detail, more than anything else, is what made the Clips hit differently. 6 blocks from a dominant rim protector is one thing. 6 blocks from a collection of defenders just doing their jobs is something else entirely. Something that points directly back to the mechanics and the release point and the fundamental questions that have been swirling around her game for longer than just this season. 21 points sounds impressive. It really does. You see that number on a box score and your brain registers it as a productive offensive night. But box scores are designed to tell you what happened, not how it happened. And the how in this case is where everything gets complicated and contentious in a way that has the basketball community genuinely divided. Of those 21 points, a striking portion came from the free throw line. Not a small portion. Not the kind of free throw contribution that you'd call routine for a post player who draws contact regularly. Nearly half. When you break it down and do the actual math against her field goal numbers, the picture that emerges is one of a player whose scoring output was heavily dependent on the referees rather than on her own ability to create and finish through the defense. And that distinction matters enormously when evaluating what kind of player she actually is versus what the final number suggests she is. Free throws are part of basketball. Drawing fouls is a skill. Getting to the line is something coaches teach and players work on. Nobody is arguing that points from the free throw line don't count or that players shouldn't try to draw contact. That's not the controversy. The controversy is about whether the fouls being called were legitimate, whether they met the standard being applied to other players in the same game, and whether there's a consistency problem with how referees are handling situations involving Angel Reese specifically. Because when you watch the clips from this game, some of the foul calls are genuinely difficult to explain. Defenders in position, minimal contact, standard defensive plays that get whistled as fouls when Reese is involved, but get ignored when other players are in the exact same situation. The comparison that kept coming up in commentary was EJECTED Wilson, one of the most dominant players in the WNBA and a player who puts herself in harm's way driving to the basket regularly. Wilson drives and draws contact and doesn't get the same whistle. She absorbs hits that would send other players to the line and keeps playing. That comparison landed hard because Wilson isn't some marginal player who could be dismissed as a lesser talent getting overlooked. She's arguably the best player in the league. If the best player in the league is driving into defenders and not getting foul calls while Reese is getting whistles on plays where defenders barely make contact, that's not a small discrepancy. That's a pattern that demands explanation, and nobody from the officiating side has offered one. The phrase that started circulating online after this game, and it's a phrase that's going to be uncomfortable to say out loud, but is worth acknowledging because it reflects the genuine conversation happening around this, was protected species. The idea being that Angel Reese operates under a different set of officiating rules than the players around her. That the whistle comes faster, more frequently, and with less justification than it does for comparable players in comparable situations. Now it's important to be clear that this framing is speculative. Nobody has proven that there's any deliberate or organized favoritism in how she's being officiated. What people are reacting to is a pattern they believe they're observing across multiple games, and patterns can be misleading. Small sample sizes, specific matchup contexts, referee tendencies that have nothing to do with the player involved. All of these things can create the appearance of something that isn't actually there in the way it appears. But here's the thing. When the same conversation keeps coming up game after game, when analysts and coaches and fans across different fan bases are all pointing at the same clips and asking the same questions, it stops being a one-game observation and starts being something that the league probably needs to look at seriously. Not necessarily because there's wrongdoing happening, but because the perception itself is damaging. To the integrity of the game, to the other players competing against her, and honestly to Reese herself. Because if people believe your numbers are inflated by officiating rather than skill, your actual accomplishments get dismissed, along with the questionable ones. Caleb Clark was brought up in this context, and it's a comparison worth thinking about. Clark is a player with arguably sharper fundamentals, particularly in terms of shot creation and decision-making, but she doesn't see the same foul call frequency that Reese does. Commentators asking how many points Clark would average with the same whistle aren't being entirely serious, but the underlying point is real. Free throw volume changes a player's statistical output dramatically, and when that volume appears disconnected from the actual quality of the defensive play against them, the numbers stop being a reliable measure of anything. There are moments in sports where a coach loses it on the sideline, and you kind of understand why, but also think they probably should have kept it together. And then there are moments where a coach loses it, and everything about the context makes the reaction feel completely understandable, even if the ejection itself was inevitable the moment the second technical got called. Becky Hammond's exit from this game falls very much into the second category. Hammond is not a coach who makes a habit of getting thrown out of games. She's been around professional basketball long enough to know how to manage her reactions, how to make her point to an official without crossing the line that gets you removed from the building. So when she picked up 2 technical fouls in relatively quick succession and found herself walking to the locker room before the game was finished, the natural question is what exactly pushed her past the point of no return in a way that her usual composure couldn't contain. The answer, when you watch the sequence of events, is pretty straightforward. She watched foul call after foul call go Angel Reese's way on plays where the contact was minimal or the call was genuinely questionable. She watched her own players, including A'ja Wilson, the best player on her roster and arguably in the entire league, drive to the basket and take real contact without getting the same whistle. She watched the free throw discrepancy build in real time, point by point, trip to the line by trip to the line. And at some point, her ability to sit on that frustration ran out. The first technical is almost always survivable. Coaches get techs. It happens. You say something to an official that crosses the line, you get the tee, you take a breath and you refocus. What's interesting about Hammond's situation is that the first technical didn't seem to reset her at all. If anything, it might have made things worse, because the game continued and the calls continued, and the frustration that had been building didn't dissipate just because she'd already been warned. By the time the second technical came, it felt less like an escalation and more like an inevitability. What happened after the ejection was almost as revealing as the ejection itself. Hammond didn't go quietly. She had things to say to the official on her way out, and while the specifics of that conversation aren't captured clearly enough to quote directly, the body language told its own story. She wasn't angry in the way coaches get angry when they feel disrespected personally. She was angry in the way coaches get angry when they believe something fundamentally unfair is happening to their team and nobody in a position to fix it is doing anything about it. The official she was arguing with walked away. That detail matters. When an official walks away from a coach who is still clearly in the middle of making a point, it communicates something about how that official perceived the interaction. Whether it was a power move, an attempt to de-escalate by removing engagement, or simply the official deciding there was nothing more worth hearing. The visual of Hammond still talking to a referee who had already turned and walked away became one of the more discussed moments from the game online. Now, to be fair to the officiating side of this, coaches sometimes see fouls that aren't there, especially when they're watching from the sideline and their emotional investment in the outcome colors their perception of close calls. Hammond was watching her team lose ground in a game where she needed wins. Her star player wasn't getting calls she felt were deserved. That context makes every whistle feel more significant than it might actually be. It's entirely possible that some of the calls Hammond objected to were legitimate, and she simply couldn't see them from her angle, with the emotion of the moment clouding her judgment. But here's what makes her reaction resonate beyond just being a coach losing her temper. The specific contrast she was reacting to, Reese getting calls on minimal contact, while Wilson drives and absorbs real hits without a whistle, is documented in the clips. It's visible. It's the same thing analysts and fans were reacting to from their couches and press boxes. So when Hammond went nuclear, she wasn't going nuclear over a general sense of bad officiating. She was reacting to something specific and visible that a lot of people watching the same game were seeing and questioning simultaneously. Her ejection became the second biggest story of the night, which is saying something given everything else that happened. But in some ways, it also functioned as a validator for the conversation around the officiating. Because when a veteran coach with her experience and composure hits her breaking point over foul calls, it suggests the calls were unusual enough to produce an unusual reaction. Here's the question that cuts to the heart of everything surrounding Angel Reese's season, and this game specifically. When you look at her stat line, 21 points, 10 rebounds, 4 assists, 4 steals, 6 for 13 from the field, 39 minutes played. What are you actually looking at? Is this the stat line of a legitimate, productive professional basketball player making a real impact on winning games? Or is it a collection of numbers that, when you pull apart how they were generated, tells a much more complicated story about what she's actually contributing versus what the box score suggests? Let's start with the minutes. 39 minutes is a lot of time on the court. She played almost the entire game, sitting for a single minute. That level of playing time suggests the coaching staff believes in her enough to keep her out there, which is worth acknowledging. You don't play a player nearly the full game if you think they're actively hurting you. So at the very minimum, her coaches see something valuable enough in her presence to keep her on the floor. But here's where things get complicated. 39 minutes and 6 blocks against you means that, for a significant portion of that time, the defense was successfully neutralizing her attempts to score through the field. 6 blocks in 39 minutes, combined with a 6 for 13 shooting line, paints a picture of someone who was trying repeatedly to do something the defense was largely preventing her from doing. The rebounds and the steals are real and uncontroversial. She's active, and she competes on the glass, and those numbers reflect genuine effort and positioning. But the scoring number is where the scrutiny belongs. If you remove the free throw points from her total and look only at what she generated from actual field goal attempts, the picture looks very different from 21 points. And this is where the stat padding argument gains its traction, because in the modern analytical era of basketball, the distinction between points that come from creating and finishing versus points that come from the free throw line is considered significant. Not because free throw points are worth less in the final score, but because they represent different things about a player's ability to create offense. A player who scores 21 points on strong field goal percentage while drawing some fouls along the way is telling you something clear. This player can create offense and finish. A player who scores 21 points with a below-average field goal conversion rate and a disproportionate number of free throw trips is telling you something different. This player is getting to the line a lot, but struggling to convert when the defense is actually challenging them. Those are two different players, and they require two different evaluations. The travels are another piece of this puzzle that deserves attention. Multiple traveling violations in a single game, and reports suggest the actual number of travels that could have been called was significantly higher than what got whistled, indicate a player who is rushing her footwork in the post. Now here's the irony in that, and it connects back to the blocks. If she's rushing her footwork to get into her finishing position, and if that rushing is leading her to release the ball lower than she should, then the travels and the blocks are connected. They're both symptoms of a post-game that doesn't have the patience and precision at its foundation that elite post-scoring requires. 4 assists and 4 steals round out the line and are genuinely positive. Finding teammates in productive spots 4 times and coming up with 4 steals shows basketball awareness and defensive activity that can't be entirely dismissed. But in the context of 6 blocks against her and a lopsided free throw situation, those numbers get somewhat buried in the broader conversation about whether she's the player her most enthusiastic supporters claim she is. The honest answer is probably somewhere in the middle, which is almost always the case with polarizing athletes. She's not the generational talent her biggest fans insist she is based on numbers that require this much context to interpret properly. But she's also not completely without value, and the 10 rebounds and defensive activity suggest she contributes in ways that don't always show up in the parts of the box score that get the most attention. The problem is that, in the current environment surrounding her game, nuance gets drowned out by both the cheerleaders and the critics, and the truth sits somewhere neither side is particularly interested in occupying. For most of this season, Angel Reese had been operating in a relatively manageable media environment. There was criticism. There always is when a high-profile player struggles with certain aspects of their game, but the level of daily scrutiny she was facing was not at the fever pitch it has since reached. That changed when she made an accusation against New York Liberty head coach Sandy Bindello that sent shockwaves through the basketball community and fundamentally altered the conversation around everything connected to her name. The accusation, in essence, was that Bindello had made a comment or taken an action that Reese interpreted as racially motivated. This is an extremely serious allegation in any professional context, and in sports, where the history of racial dynamics is long and complicated and very real, accusations like this carry enormous weight. They demand to be taken seriously. They also demand to be examined carefully, because the consequences, for the person making the accusation and the person being accused, are significant regardless of what the investigation eventually concludes. What made the Bindello situation particularly explosive was the reaction from multiple corners of the basketball world. Reports suggest that many within the league, players, coaches, analysts with access to information about what actually happened in that situation, were skeptical of the framing. Not necessarily saying that nothing happened, but questioning whether what Reese described matched the intent behind whatever Bindello said or did. Bindello herself, by all accounts, was stunned by the accusation and denied any racial motivation in her actions. It's important to be clear that this remains a disputed situation. We don't know with certainty exactly what was said, exactly what the context was, or exactly how it was intended versus how it was received. What we do know is the accusation became a massive story that generated headlines across sports media for days, dominated social media conversations, and put both Reese and Bindello at the center of one of the more uncomfortable disputes the WNBA has dealt with in recent memory. And we know that the timing of when it became public was notable. Before the Bindello accusation surfaced publicly, Reese had been somewhat below the radar in terms of the intensity of coverage she was receiving. Her performances were being discussed, her numbers were being analyzed, but the conversation was at a manageable volume. After the accusation went public, her name was everywhere. Every game she played became bigger news. Every stat line got more scrutiny. Every blocked shot and every questionable foul call attracted more attention than it would have attracted in the world that existed before the accusation changed everything. This is where the speculation gets uncomfortable, and it's worth framing it very clearly as speculation because nobody can read another person's mind or motivations. But the conversation online, and in some corners of sports media, has included the suggestion that the attention generated by the accusation, regardless of its merits, served a purpose for Reese's brand and profile at a moment when her on-court performance was generating the wrong kind of attention. Whether that suggestion is fair or accurate is genuinely impossible to say with any certainty. What can be said is that the accusation created a dynamic where any criticism of her game became more charged than it would otherwise be, because it now existed in the context of a racial accusation. Critiquing her release point or her footwork in the post became something that critics had to be more careful about, not because those critiques were unfair or racially motivated, but because the environment had shifted in a way where any negativity directed at her could potentially be framed as connected to the broader controversy. That's a complicated dynamic, and it affected how the discourse around her season unfolded. Sandy Bindello was described by people who know her as genuinely hurt by the accusation. By all accounts, she's a respected figure in women's basketball with a long track record across multiple coaching stops. And the idea that she harbored racial bias in her coaching decisions was something that people close to her found inconsistent with the person they know. Again, that's not proof of anything either way. People close to someone are not always the most objective evaluators, but it's part of the picture. What the Bindello situation ultimately did was ensure that Angel Reese remained one of the most talked about names in the WNBA heading into the final stretch of the regular season. With a combination of on-court performance questions and off-court controversy, creating a story that was impossible to look away from. Whether that attention helps her or hurts her in the long run remains to be seen. But right now, heading into the rest of this season, every game she plays carries a weight and a scrutiny that few players in the league are dealing with at the same level. So here's where we land. A player who couldn't sleep after her last disaster came back and got blocked 6 times. She finished with 21 points that require a considerable amount of context to interpret honestly. Her coach got ejected arguing about foul calls. And a racism accusation that shifted the entire media landscape around her season is still unresolved and still casting a shadow over every conversation about her game. The question nobody seems to be able to answer cleanly is whether Angel Reese is a legitimately developing professional talent who is getting unfairly buried by an unusually intense microscope, or whether the performance level on the court is genuinely not matching the profile she's built off of it. The rest of this season is going to answer that question whether anyone is ready for the answer or not. Drop your thoughts below. This one is worth the conversation.